Chapter 3. Mick brushed away the scum. The stagnant water stunk, but he dipped 2 billies full of it. The hell, he thought, if a man cooked cabbage in it, it'd smell just the same. He scuff-toed back up the bank. Rick sat on a log under a bald-topped gum tree. Joe unbuckled a pack bag. "Here y'are," Mick said. "Here's 2 of the best. If you dropped a bone in, you could make pea soup." Rick looked along the river, down towards the scattered buildings of Yorinda, up towards the slowly westering sun. "She's dry all right," he said. "A man could spit across her at the widest part." Mick wiped mud from his boots on a saddle blanket, then rubbed the blanket on a tree. "I don't know about that," he said, "but what are you sittin' there for?" "I thought we was headin' for town." He looked down at the billies. "A man brings you water to shave with, and all you can do is sit on a log and bellyache about the river." Joe nodded. "That's it," he grunted. "We're wastin' time." He tipped water in a scoured-out jam tin, rubbed soap on his face. "Say, Mick," he went on, remembering the drive through Yorinda's main street, "d'you remember that filly we saw this afternoon? The one outside old Miss Higgins' cafe?" Mick dipped his brush in the jam tin. He shared it with Joe. Rick had a tea pannikin. Mick wiped the brush round his chin. "Yeah," he said, "I do. Now you mention it, she had a pretty smart line to her. Must be someone new in these parts. Too dottied up for the locals." Joe spat out a tongue lick of lather. "She was at that," he spluttered. "Showed a hell of a lot of class. Nice lookin' too." Mick nodded thoughtfully. He felt warm inside. The hand scraping with the razor showed almost black in the cracked mirror. "A man don't get much chance with her sort," he grunted. "They aim too high on a tree." Joe scrubbed his chin roughly, rubbing the towel in behind his ears, then down his neck. "They do it that," he said. "You ain't in the race. You need dough, and a lot of it." He looked round at the stacked pack saddles. "Not this bloody junk." Rick rinsed his pannikin. A trickle of blood seeped down his chin. He dabbed at it with his towel. "The hell," he said. "Listen to you bastards talk. I damn near cut my throat." Mick's hairy hand pawed in the tucker box. He scooped out a fingertip full of salt. "Slap a bit of this on it," he grunted. "She'll dry off before you hit the town." Rick rubbed in the salt. Joe did a little shuffle round the saddles, changing his shirt. Mick whistled through his teeth. "You know," Joe said, unbuckling his belt and tucking in the shirt, "a man's all stirred up and rarin' to go. He can smell the grog from here." He sniffed towards Yorinda. "Yeah," he added, "I can smell her all right." They took turns in the mirror, combing their hair. Mick scraped his straight back. Joe put a parting on the side. Rick did the same, then slammed on his hat. "God damn it," he said. "You'd think we were goin' skirt-tailin' instead of elbow-propping in a bar. Come on, Let's get out of it." Mick took a final look, setting his hat carefully, wide brim well down over his eyes. Joe did the same. He dusted his sweaty shirt front. Mick copied him. They set their belt buckles dead center over their navels. Rick picked up the water billy. "I give you 1 second," he said, "or you'll get the flamin' lot. Fair over the pair of ya. Now get movin'." They walked along the river bank, laughing. Dust drifted over their boots. To the one side, mud in the drying river stunk in the sun. To the other, flat country stretched for an immensity of distance. Burinda drew nearer. The track they followed angled round towards the bridge. They boot-stomped over its wide steel surface. In the middle, Mick slapped his hand on a steel-walled side. "She's had a few cattle over her," he said. "More than a man could ever count." Joe spat on the center girder bolts. "That's for luck," he said, "with our next flamin' lot." They walked on. On the other side of the bridge, the track changed to built-up red dirt. They followed it round a bend, into Main Street. The awninged shop fronts and verandaed hotels stretched before them. They eased down to a bow-legging stroll. Joe stared in the store windows. Bloomers, dresses, saddles, tin stuff, everything except green vegetables. "This is the life," he grinned. "Civilization." Mick hooked a thumb in his belt. "Yeah," he said, "we're really living it up." They strolled on towards Dawes' office. Outside the board-walled building, Rick stared in through the doorway. Behind a paper-littered desk, Dawes bulged in a chair. "He's in there," Rick said. "I'll go in and have a yarn with him. See what's doin'. I'll meet you up the pub later if you like." Mick started towards the door. "The hell you will," he grunted. "We always have the first one together, and we ain't gonna change now." They shouldered in through the doorway. "Good day, Mick," Dawes said. "It's good to see ya." "Good day, Rick." "You too, Joe." "Good day, Jim." They nodded. Dawes pushed up to his feet. The chair tipped back behind him. "Sit down," he said. His heavy hand waved round the office. "Shove ya behinds on anything you can see." Rick shook his head. "No," he said. "She's right, Jim. We ain't talkin' business. Just dropped in to see how things are goin'. We'll come in tomorrow if you've got anything lined up." Dawes eased himself back in the chair. "God damn it," he thought. "They're all bone and gristle. There's not an ounce of meat on the three of 'em." "Well," he said, "if you won't sit down, I can't do anything about it. But I would like ya to come in tomorrow. Bill Shawcross has been in today, and he's got a mob nearly ready. His men are working on 'em now. He heard you was on the way back, and timed his trip into town so as to be here when you got in. He's dropping in again tomorrow before he goes out." "That'll suit us fine," Rick said. Joe panted in the doorway. Mick dribbled froth from his lips. Rick turned to watch them. His face cracked when he turned back to Dawes. "You see how it is, Jim," he said. "The bastards are dying on me. I got to get 'em up to the pub." Dawes nodded. Little balls of sweat slid on his face. "Get 'em to hell out of it," he chuckled, "and get 'em soaked up. If I had a gut as small as you fellers, I'd feel much the same. Anyway, if I get through some of this stuff in time." He scruffed his hand through the littered papers. "I might drop by and have a drink with ya. Which pub will you be?" "You do that," Rick said, "and we'll look for ya." He was halfway to the door when he added, "Either the Stockman's or the Rond." The three went out through the doorway. Dawes stared at their shirted backs. "So long," he called. Their three heads nodded. "So long," they said. They heel-rocked towards Joan's cafe. Easy does it, Joe thought. A man might see her around. Do his eyes good. Mick thought the same. They glanced through the window. Joan was bent over the counter, busy with something in her hands. Joe clucked his tongue. "They don't come any better," he said softly. "She's ribbed up like a champion." Mick nodded. "She is at that," he said. "She is at that." You couldn't falter. They walked on, each with his thoughts. Under the Ron's Hotel's wide veranda, Dan Dennis lurched on the pavement. He eased back against a post, rested there swaying. Joe jerked ahead. "He's had a skinful," he said. "It's running out of his eyes." "It didn't take him long," Mick grunted. "I saw him on the street today when we went through with the horses. Him and his brother, they were down near the bend when we were headin' for the bridge." "That's right," Rick nodded. "I saw him too, but that was 3 or 4 hours ago, and a lot can happen in that time. A man can sink a lot of grog. Anyway," he added, "this fella ain't in the same class as Bidet. Never was." "Same class is right," Mick said. "But what class would that be?" Rick scratched behind one ear. "I don't know," he said. "You've got me there, Mick. A man just can't count that low." "I didn't think you could," Mick grunted. They went under the veranda, up the step towards the bar. Dan Daniels turned a sodden face after them, held out a brown, wavering hand. "G'day there," he grunted. "G'day, fellas. When d'ye get in? Ain't seen ya around for a while." Rick and Joe elbowed in through the doorway. Mick looked back over his shoulder. The dirty hoof scrapings, he thought. The mongrel was dropped on the ground and hatched by the sun. He stared hard-eyed at Dan. "Maybe you ain't," Mick said, "and maybe it's just as well. A man's luck don't hold all the time." Dan Dennis slewed away from the post. "Ah," he grunted, "that's how she is it? You're one of them big bouncin' bludgers." "That's right," Mick said. "That's just what I am. And that's just how she is. Any time you think it might be different, you know where I'll be." He followed Rick in through the doorway. Inside, a dozen men propped elbows on the bar. The mahogany shone with the sheen of spilt beer. Dusty boots thudded on the sawdusted floor. Voices beat in a muffled hum against the frosted glass windows. "Hell," Joe said. "It never seems to change." He reached over the bar for a cloth, wiped a section of the counter clean, then tossed the cloth back. "There you are," he added. "You've got room to spread your arms. Get yourselves set for a bit of steady drinkin'." Rick reached for his note fold. Here we go, he thought. Another night out on the town. The pub's a bit better than Gin Bar, but she stinks much the same. He nodded at the barman. "Line 'em up, and don't knock the heads off," he said. "We like to taste the suds." He fingered inside the note fold. "How you fellers holding? Do you want a strap from the wallet, or can you wait till tomorrow when we go to the bank?" Mick poked a finger in his buttoned shirt pocket, felt the dampness of sweat-soaked notes. "No, I'm right," he grunted. "How about you, Joe? Can you stay with her for tonight?" Joe slapped a hand on his rump. "I can ride her into the ground," he said. They felt the beer flow down. Mick wiped the froth from his mouth. Joe hitched up his belt. "Set 'em up again," he said to the barman, "and keep 'em comin'. Don't wait for us to shout." The barman slid fresh glasses along the bar. The flannel-throated saddle-bashers, he thought, come in here after a cattle-flogging trip, and think they own the place, think they can drink, put 'em up against a regular barfly like Bidet Dennis, and they'd fall flat on their faces. The barman slapped down some change. "I'll set 'em up," he said, "if you can knock 'em down." "We'll knock 'em," Mick grunted, "but don't stick around. Just keep an eye on us, like Joe told ya." The barman slid his pot-belly away along the bar. His pudgy hands collected glasses. Joe stared after him. "You know," Joe said, "I never did like that beer jerker. He's too flamin' crawly. Gives you the bloody creeps." "He does at that," Mick nodded. "You're right about bein' crawly. He's got less hairs on his chest than a snake." "What are you worryin' about him for?" Rick asked. He had a glass to his lips. Behind him, the dying sun splashed molten gold on the window. Heat reflected from the fire-red panes. "Goddamn it," he thought, "a man's shirt is always plastered to his back. The beer goes in, and the sweat comes out." Joe looked up at him. "We ain't worryin'," he said. "We're just talkin'." "That's right," Mick added. "Just passin' the time, sociable-like." "You talk about some interesting things," Rick said. The barman slid close with more full glasses. "You're draggin' the chain," he told them. "I've brought you double-headers to keep up with the rush." Mick stared across the bar. The white-faced bar crawler, he thought. The hell with him. Mick rocked back on his heels. The shirt strained across his chest. "You can stack 'em," he grunted, "and beat it. We're havin' a private conversation." The barman twisted a lip. "This is good," he thought. "The cow chaser's gettin' mad. Been too long in the sun. Another hour and he'll be fight-happy. Bash the first one to bump him." The barman jabbed a finger on the till. The drawer was always kept open. "Yeah," he said, "that's one way of gettin' rid of your wind." Rick choked. He set a glass back on the bar. "Can you beat 'em?" he chuckled. "He's madder than a death adder, clubbed with a blunt axe." "Yeah, and I know why he is," Joe said. "I just remembered. He poked Mick in the ribs. You remember that last time we were in here, the night before we pulled out on the last trip. Rick wasn't with us. He stayed back in camp." Mick pulled the hat down over his puzzled forehead, scratched a finger round behind one ear. "No," he said. "I'm buggered if I do." "Why, what happened?" Joe drained a glassful of beer. "Nothin' much," he said, "except old Curly Top ain't forgettin'." He jerked a thumb at the barman. "You tipped a glass of beer fair over his head." Mick, too, drained a glass. He felt better. "A man does the right thing sometimes. Did I do that?" he wondered. "Fancy me doing a thing like that. You'd never think I had it in me." "You would if you could think," Joe said. As he said it, Dawes bolted in through the doorway behind them. Rick felt the big man's heavy hand crush on his shoulder. "How are you there, boys?" Dawes said. "I see you've got it lined up." He nodded at the bar. The barman came across. "Good night, Mr. Dawes," he said. "What's it gonna be?" Mick slapped a hand on the bar. For crying out loud, he thought. The dirty toe liquor, crawling on his navel to a man like Dawes. Mick brushed aside empty glasses. "Never mind all that bull," he said. "You get rid of some of these. We'll look after Mr. Dawes." He turned to Dawes. "Glad you made it, Jim. What can I shout you to? We're drinking beer." He waved a hand at the glasses. Dawes slid the hand from Rick's shoulder and pushed up to the bar. He groped in a pocket, strained tight by his belly bulge. "No," he grunted, "I ain't staying long. So, the shout's on me." His hand came out, empty. He beckoned to the barman. "Listen, Jack." The barman bent over. "Set 'em up the same again twice, and book 'em up to me. I came away from the office without any dough." "Sure, Mr. Dawes," the barman said. "And what about you? You in on it too?" Dawes chuckled. "What the hell do you think I'd be? Dying of thirst while they swim in it." Mick leaned heavily on the bar. "Well," he said, "that's slap in the eye for me." He looked at Dawes, sweating face. "A man asks you in for a drink, and you do the buyin' yourself." "No, you didn't," Dawes said. "I told you I'd look in." "Aw, shut up," Joe said to Mick. "He's got more dough than a duck has feathers. Besides, today ain't the only day." "No, you're right, at that," Mick grunted. "We'll have him out of that office one day in the week, and floor him." "Geez," Rick broke in, "you can count me out o' that. The grog ain't been brewed that can upend him. He's got too much gut. Never fill him up." Dawes shook his great body with a chuckle. "The saddle sweaters," he thought. "They're great fellows to be out with. The three of 'em are so close, you couldn't put a piece of paper in between them. But they made you feel one of them." "Aw, I wouldn't say that," he said. "And when you think back, there's been times when it's been close." He looked around at the three. "You remember that night when Rick drove my car and I rode on the bonnet? You two fellers climbed up on the hood." "Yeah," Rick remembered. "She was on that night all right." Mick swirled the beer round in his glass. "She was on all right," he said. "That was the night before we picked up old Callahan's mob, wasn't it?" "I think it was." Dawes chuckled. Then he wrinkled his forehead. "Or was it? I thought it was somewhere around New Year's Eve." "No," Mick said. "New Year's Eve, my eye. It was in late February. I remember because it was just after that we had the last decent rains." "To hell with it, anyway," Joe grunted. "Whenever it was a bloody good night. I wouldn't mind another one like it." "Nor me either," Mick said. Dawes rubbed a big hand round his chin. "No," he agreed, "it was good all right. But the trouble is now," he slapped his heavy paunch, "a man's getting too fat, and too bloody respectable. It's all right for you fellers. You're in for a week or two, then out and away again." "Listen to 'em," Joe said. "You'd think he was sorry." He glanced up and down Dawes' bulky figure. "Another year, and y'all have to lever. I'm out of his chair with a crowbar. Dawes' face changed. For a moment he thought of Joan. God damn it, he thought, if you only knew how sorry. A man works out his life in the back country. He accustoms himself to its heat, dust, and loneliness. Then the one woman comes along when it's too late. He reached for a glass on the bar. Rick watched Dawes' face, noticed the change in it. Now what's wrong, he thought. Dawes can take a ribbing with the next man and come back for more. Something must be hurting deep under the skin. Rick stared hard at Joe, lowered a lid over one eye. For spitting out dust, he said, you fellers'll bog down in the past. Let's stick to what's doing tonight, anyway. He added to Dawes, this mob we're taking for Shawcross, what are they? Bullocks or wet cattle? Dawes emptied the glass. The beer washed down smooth over his throat. He sighed when he set the glass back on the bar. No, he said, they ain't cows and calves, they're bullocks. Stores. He wants to get them into the railhead and truck 'em down to a bit of better grass. He reckons there'll be about 800 of 'em, 4-year-olds. Mick shifted his legs, crossed one over the other. The hell, he thought, here we go again. We flog cattle all over the scrub for most of our lives. Then, when we have a night free, Rick has to start talking about them. Can you beat 'em? He said to Joe. The bludger ain't satisfied with staring at their rumps for months on end. He has to bring 'em into the pub. Joe's boot inched along through the sawdust, kicked into Mick's legginged legs. Shut up, Joe said, and buy yourself a gag. You never was a cattleman's armhole. Mick buried his nose in a glass. The little squirt, he thought. If he wasn't my mate, I'd flatten him. Rick nodded at Dawes. They'll be all right, he said. They shouldn't give much trouble. A man can push 'em along over the dry patches. What do you mean? Mick grunted. Over the dry patches. It's all flamin' dry. There ain't a patch of green feed or a decent water hole between here and the Darling. And that's nearly 400 miles, he added. You know what I mean, Rick said. Bullocks are not like cows and calves. They stand up to it better. The barman sidled up on the other side of the counter. He prodded Mick on the arm. How about it, he said. You've got a stack of empties. If I stand 'em up, can you still knock 'em down? Mick peered across at him. The hell I can, he said. And you too. Keep 'em comin', or I'll christen ya again. The barman twitched a lip. He linked his fingers into 2 handfuls of glasses. The day that happens, he said, I'll be waiting. Mick thumped a hand on the bar. A man ought to, he started to say, when Dawes broke in. Leave me out of it, Mick, he said. I've got to be on my way. There's a meeting on to discuss putting on street lighting in Yorinda. I'm on the committee. Joe whistled. Can you beat that? He said. The old town'll be like Sydney, lit up from head to tail. Rick looked at him. What do you know about Sydney? He grinned. You've only been there once, and that was on a cattle train. Anyway, he went on to Dawes. You can stand another one. It won't keep you long. What I was going to ask you about is men. We'll need another 2 or 3 and a cook for sure. Do you know of any around in town? I haven't had time yet to look around myself. Dawes rubbed a hand down his face. Y'all be all right for men, he said thoughtfully. Shawcross is paying off a couple, and you can have them, but I don't know about a cook. What happened to your last one? Ted Hines, wasn't it? You had him for a year or two. Did he walk out on you? No, Rick grunted. He got kicked in the guts. A horse broke 4 of his ribs. We had to leave him behind in Bombala Hospital. It's not only his ribs, he's a bit tied up inside. Probably be there for a month or 2. That's bad luck, Dawes said. Mick pushed away from the bar. He stretched his arms. The hell it was, he yawned. The sod bloody near poisoned us. He looked down at Joe. I'm gettin' full of this. 2 flaming dead. No action. A man's getting cramps in his legs. Yeah, Joe nodded. It is a bit that way. Sorta depressin'. Dawes chuckled. His last glass was empty. He set it on the bar. Well, he said, before you start anything, let me get out of it. I'm a justice of the peace, and it wouldn't pay me to get tangled up in a brawl. Rick shook his head. You don't have to worry, he said. They're full of wind and water. But about this cook, you don't think we could find one in town? Ah, I wouldn't say that. Dawes wiped a handkerchief round the fold of his neck. A power motor hummed at the back of the hotel. Electric light beamed down on the bar. Bill Bates, for one, is around town, and he's a damned good cook. He was with Jeff Mooney's plant for years. Well, why can't we get him then? Rick said. He drained another glass. The hell with this, he thought. Each one tastes worse than the other. A man's only drinking for the sake of getting knocked. He slid the glass on the bar. What's wrong with him? Doesn't he want a job? Dawes hitched his belt and tucked in his shirt, glanced at his watch. I'll be late, he grunted. Look, Rick, we'll bash it out tomorrow. Might have a yarn with Bates, if I can get him into the office. But I've been told he won a hell of a wad in the 2-up game behind the billiard room on Sunday. Mick put a hand back on the bar, crossed his legs again. You can scrub him then, he said. He won't come up for air until he's drunk it all, or lost it again. God damn it, he added. It must have been some game. For a man to clean a wad that size. If it's as big as you say, it's big all right, Dawes grunted. Round about 400 quid. Joe whistled through his teeth. The lucky dough puncher, he thought. 400 quid for an afternoon's spinning. Heads for luck. Tails for a dead loss. Joe sighed. That's the way it goes, he said. A man can never tell. You can stew up a bit of meat for a few lousy quid a week, or toss a couple of pennies and crack a few hundred, or lose a few hundred. Dawes looked round at them. Well, I'm on my way. See you fellers tomorrow. So long. He waved a heavy hand. His great body lumbered towards the door. Rick watched him go. So long, he said. Mick and Joe leaned on the bar. So long, they nodded. The door swung closed. Rick turned back to the bar. He breasted up to it, in between Mick and Joe. The 3 stared down at the glasses. Joe eased himself over to rest on 2 elbows. Mick did the same. Rick stared into the fly-specked mirror at the back of the bar. He saw his dusty hat-tipped reflection. The hell, he grunted. What do we do now? The party's gone. Dead on us. Mick bumped a glass with his elbow. "No, it ain't," he said. "We're just having a breather." They sagged on the mahogany in silence. Voices droned round them. 4 men at the back of Joe cut cards for drinks. A man at the end of the room started to sing. His voice was husky, deep-throated. He sang about his mother waiting in a rose-covered cottage, waiting for him to come home. Joe spat in the sawdust. "The bastard never saw a rose," he grunted. "Neither alone his mother." Mick stared down the room at the singer. "He must have had one," he said. The barman slid close. His hands gathered in the glasses. "How's it comin'?" he said. He leered up at Mick. "Can you still knock 'em if I stack 'em?" Mick grabbed the barman's shirt front, twisted it round into a balled-up knot. He hauled the man up on his tiptoes. "Listen," Mick grated. "I don't know what's the matter with ya, but whatever it is, you're beginnin' to make me tired, rubbin' me under the saddle." The men behind Joe stopped talking. One of them turned round to put his head over Joe's shoulder. He stared from Mick to the barman. "What's the matter, Mick?" he said. "Are you tryin' to choke 'em?" Rick straightened back on his boot heels. He pulled the hat forward over his eyes. "Oh ho," he thought. "Here it comes. The usual first night performance." He eased his other hand out of his pocket. Joe sagged lower on the bar. Mick pushed the barman away. The buttons tore from the twisted shirt. A splash of white skin showed in the gap. "The poor little sod," Mick thought. "He ain't got a hair on his chest." Mick rested back on the bar. He hooked a thumb in his belt. "No," he said, "I'm just trying to shake hands." The man pushed closer to Joe. Joe felt the hard chest pressing down on his shoulder. "You got a funny way of doing it," the man said. He looked round at the 3. "You know," he went on, "every time you blokes come into town, you start looking for trouble." One of the men behind spat in the sawdust. "Aw, let it drop, Phil," he said. "He'll belt the ears off ya." Phil leaned forward still further. "The hell he will," he grunted. "Him or 10 like him." Joe crushed closer to the bar. Rick balanced on the balls of his feet. Mick kept the thumb hooked in his belt. "This is going to be good," he thought. "Liven the place up a bit." "Well," he said, "the ain't 10 of me, so y'all have to be satisfied with 1. Joe braced his arms. "He's about right now," he thought. "Give it to him hard." He stamped backwards onto Phil's boot. Phil's body jerked down. Joe's shoulder drove up, smashing onto Phil's chin. Joe whirled and slammed his fist just above Phil's belt buckle. Phil gagged twice as he slid to the ground. Joe rubbed his fist. "It don't take 10 of 'em, Mick," he panted. "Only 1 of me." Mick nodded. "That's about right," he said. "You made a neat job of 'em." "What do you reckon, Rick?" Rick rubbed a hand down his chin. "Yeah," he agreed. "He did at that. But what about his mates?" He nodded at the 3 men. "Maybe they want to go on with it." One of the men shook his head. The hoof mark scarred on one side of his face twitched. "No," he said. "She's right. You can leave it right where it is." He stuck out his chin by a mile. He looked across at Mick. Let his eyes flicker up and down. "But I tell you what," he added to Mick, "One of these days I'm gonna have ya, just to see how good you are." Mick tucked in his shirt. "What about now?" he grunted. "She's as good a time as any." The man spat down in between his boots. "No," he said, "I ain't in the mood." "Well, let it ride for today." Phil groaned on the floor. He pushed up onto his hands, and rested with his head hanging. "The hell," he gasped. "I'm crook. What hit me?" Joe bent down and hauled him to his feet. He set the hat straight on Phil's head. "Nothing, mate," Joe said. "It's just you was pushin' me too far. You was treadin' on me corns." Phil nodded. He stood sag-chested, sucking in air. Finally he straightened. His face showed white under its tan. "I'm right," he nodded, nodded to Joe. "We'll take it on from here. You can take another crack at me and see how you go." Joe's face creased in a grin. "Can you beat that?" he thought. "He's as sick as a dog. Yet he wants to go on." He leaned back on the bar. "No," he said, "you've had it rough. You ain't right yet. But I'll tell ya what I will do. I'll buy you a drink, and that goes for you fellas too." He waved at the three men. The hoof-scarred man placed an arm on Phil's shoulder. He urged him towards the bar. "Come on, Phil," he said, "and forget it. You can take a crack at 'em some other day. Like me and Mick here." He nodded at Mick. "That way you've got something to look forward to." Phil swayed on his 2 feet. "I haven't that," he said. Chapter 4. Rick eased his behind on the log. Above him the silvery-barked gum tree glistened in the sun. The bald-topped trunk spread little shade, but Rick was content. "The hell," he thought, "a man's sitting down. He's got his legs stretched out. What more can he want?" Then Rick remembered his sock. It had a hole in it as big as his fist. He pulled off a boot and slid the dusty sock from his foot. "Hey, Joe," he said, "throw us over the hold-all. I'm goin' to darn this sock." Joe sat back on his heels. One hand held a pair of hobble straps. The other rubbed grease into them. An open pack bag stood by his side. For flogging an ant in a jam tin, he grunted. "Why don't you wait? You can buy a new pair in Yorinda." He hooked the hobbles on a sapling and wiped his hands on a saddle blanket. "I might forget," Rick said. "You know how it goes. A man has a couple of drinks and forgets all about his feet." Joe tossed over the hold-all. "Forgets all about his feet is right," he grunted. Rick slitted his eyes against the sun glare. His hat slid back on his head. He jabbed a length of wool at a needle. "You know, Joe," he said, "this is the worst part. Once you get it through the flamin' hole, you're right." Joe picked up another set of hobble straps. His free hand gouged grease out of a tin. Can you beat him? He thought. Mick or me would throw the sock in the river. To hell with it. Not Rick. He darns it. Joe squatted back on the ground. "You're right at that," he said. Rick darned slowly. "Get her tucked in under the edges," he thought. "Then build her up in the middle. If a man keeps her that way, she won't set hard in his boot." He listened to Mick's snore coming from the river bank. Mick was sprawled in the dust. His hat tipped forward over his face. The snore changed to heavy breathing. Mick grumbled in his sleep. A tiny whirly-whirly scuttered dust over him, then whisked off his hat. The sun beat down in his face. Joe put the hat back. "The hell," he said. "Old Mick's catching up on some shut-eye." He steadied the hat on Mick's face, then bow-legged it over to the sapling. He hooked the hobbles next to the other pair. "They'll be right there," he went on. "The sun'll soften 'em up, melt the grease into 'em." Rick nodded. The hell with the hobbles, he thought. A man has his work cut out trying to do a cross-stitch. He's all right on the straight stuff, but the fancy work beats him. He put his bare foot up on the log, resting the heel on the rough bark. He wriggled his toes. Joe stared at the foot. "God damn it, mate," he grunted. "You've got a foot like a camel pad. She's coated thick with dust." Rick pushed the needle into the sock for the final time, then bit off the wool. He tucked in the loose ends. "There," he said, "that's what I call a damned good job. Neat as a pickled onion." Mick yawned under his hat. "By God," he said, and sat up. "What did ya let a man sleep for?" "We didn't let ya," Joe told him. "You just went. But now you're with us again. You can put the billy on. We can do with a drink of tea." Rick swung his leg away from the log. He eased his foot into the sock, then pulled on the boot. He stood up. "You can leave me out of the tea," he said. "I'll push on into town. There ain't much sense in waiting. She won't get any cooler." He stamped his boot in the dust. "Geez," he went on, "that feels better. A man would have had a blister." "The hell he would," Joe grunted. "You got enough dust on your foot to make a pad. Why don't we take a swim? We ain't had one since we nipped into that dam a fortnight ago." "You're getting too fussy." Mick picked up the billy. He swung it round before he tipped out the stale tea grounds. "Besides, you can't swim here. You're supposed to be at least a mile upriver from the town before you can hop in." Rick tucked in his shirt and tightened his belt. "That's right," he said, "but I tell you what. We might make it tomorrow. Take a walk upriver to that deep bend. She'll be a bit clearer up there. Won't stink so much." "Maybe you're right at that," Mick grunted, going over the bank. Joe nodded. "I'll be in it," he said, "but we'll need some more soap. I'll get a bar tonight when I'm in town." Mick heard him. "Yeah," he called, "up from the river. But don't go getting none of that fancy stuff. Get a slab of that caustic. She gets the dirt off better." "That's what I was thinking," Joe said. Rick pulled his hat low over his eyes. The felt was hot from the sun. "I'll be getting along then," he said. "I'll see you fellas later, somewhere around the town." "That's right," Joe nodded. "Me and Mick's going to grease 2 or 3 saddles. Then we'll be in after ya." Rick walked away. "So long," he said. Joe looked after him. "So long," he nodded. Halfway up the river bank, Mick put a hand to the side of his mouth. "Don't forget what your mother told ya about keeping 'em together." Rick pulled his hat lower over his eyes. "No, I won't," he chuckled, "but it was a bloody long time ago." He walked on along the river bank. Dust puffed into little clouds round his boots. Above him the sky arced in a vivid glare, and mirages danced on the horizon. At the bridge, Rick looked back, a thin column of smoke pillared up over the camp. Mick was bent down near the fire, and Joe squatted near him. It looks kind of homely, Rick thought. A man couldn't ask for much more. 2 good mates, the sky for a roof, a saddle for his pillow. He walked on into Yorinda. The main street stretched, almost deserted. Heat shimmered up from the hard-packed roadway. 2 legginged stockmen walked under the awnings. A sombreroed aboriginal squatted on the curbside. He looked round as Rick went past. "Good day there, boss," he grinned. "Ain't seen ya in a long time." "Good day there, Johnny," Rick nodded. "I've been out o' town. How's all the little pickaninnies?" Johnny pushed back the wide brim from his coal-black face. His teeth glinted whitely. "They're right, boss," he chuckled, "but they're sure can eat a lot. Their bellies close up to hangin' on the ground." Rick laughed. His boot heels echoed under the awnings. "That's the idea, Johnny," he said. "Keep it up to 'em. That way they're gonna be big fellas like you. So long, I'll see you around." Johnny settled back on the curbside. "Yeah, boss," he chuckled. "Sure, so long." "So long," Rick said. Outside Dawes' office, a dusty car sagged in the roadway. Roped-in cases protruded from the open boot. Full sacks stacked on the rear seat reached to the car's roof ceiling. "I timed it right," Rick thought. "Old Shawcross is here, inside with Dawes." Rick angled across the pavement. "How are you there, Rick?" Dawes greeted him through the doorway. "Come in and take a seat. We were just talking about you." The big man bulged behind his desk. He waved a heavy hand at Shawcross. The old cattleman nodded. He tipped back his chair and crossed one leg over the other. "Glad to see you, Rick," he said. He held out his hand. "What sort of a trip did you have? Get 'em through all right?" Rick shook the hard old hand. He brushed a file of papers to one side on the desk before he eased his behind down on it. "She wasn't too bad," he said. "We made it with 'em all right, but had to scrape the barrel in a couple of places. The feed's flogged right out. You got to ease 'em along on a belly full of dust." Dawes pulled out his handkerchief to wipe round his neck. He stared over the desk at Rick. "The hell," he thought. "The way Rick tells it, you would think it was just like that. Ease 'em along over a dry stretch. Someone someday ought to write a book about men like Rick. Tell the world of their hardships and endurance." Dawes wiped the handkerchief down his face, then spread his legs under the desk. Bill Shawcross nodded. A man takes his time to speak. He knew what it was like to shift cattle in a drought. The dumb beast stare-eyed insanity. Their soul-destroying, apathetic hoof-plodding. He had driven them himself over long treks when he was young, but he wouldn't claim to have Rick's ability. Men like Rick were born with a gift. Shawcross let his chair thump forward onto the boards. "How's the water holding?" he asked. "Getting a bit light on in places, I suppose." A blowfly buzzed in through the doorway. Rick slapped at it and threw it back on the pavement. "Yeah," he said, "it's getting light all right. It don't make much difference to the bores, of course. They're still pumping a good stream. But the ground tanks and the river banks are bloody murder. In some places, you could bog 1,000 bullocks right out of sight, and never see where they've been, except for the flamin' bubbles," he added. Dawes scratched behind one ear. "Is she as bad as that?" he said. "Yeah," Shawcross nodded. "She must be. I know by my own place. I'm losing cattle every day." He shrugged. "Just how many, it's hard to say, but I know I'm losing 'em. Every time I get a ring from an outstation or the boys ride in, I get word of another dozen or so found dead, either bogged with their eyes picked out by the crows, or withered up out on the plains, too weak to walk into water. Whichever way it goes, they're dead." Heat glared in from the roadway. A passing car spewed a long feather of dust. Rick watched the smother swirl over the pavement. "They're dead all right," he said softly, "and if it don't rain soon, there's gonna be a bloody lot more." "That's what I've been thinkin'," Shawcross nodded. He leaned back again and hooked his thumbs in his shirt pockets. "What I've lost up to date have been mostly old cattle and a few calves. If I can walk off another 800, that'll make 2,000 I've shifted so far this year. Gives the rest a better chance to pull through while we're waitin' for some rain." "Yeah, that's all right," Dawes grunted. He swiveled his great body to cock a leg up on the corner of his desk. "But the trouble is, there's a lot of others who've had the same idea. Ain't they, Rick?" he added. Rick tipped back his hat. "Sure," he said. "The tracks have been crawlin' with 'em for the last 6 months. That's what's helped to flog the feed out. A man has to shift all about the country searchin' for it." Bill Shawcross creased his weathered face in an easy grin. "God damn it," he thought, "as if I didn't know. Every damned cattleman I speak to tells me about the cattle he's had to shift." He looked up at Rick. "I know all that, Rick," he chuckled, "and I know that with every week or month that passes, it gets a darn sight harder for you and fellas like ya. But that's the way it goes. You and me can't do anything about it. It's only the bloke up there who can," and he jerked his thumb up at the ceiling. "All right," Dawes broke in. "Let's get down to business. I'm a busy man." He jabbed a finger at a stack of papers. "Look at it. A man's got so much there, he'll never catch up with it." Rick scuffed a handful of letters from a tray. He slapped them on his knee. Dust drifted over the desk. "The hell," Rick grunted. "You been sayin' that ever since I've known ya." He slapped the letters back in the tray. "And this stack of letters been there just as long. You ain't ever changed them. The ruddy things have turned yeller." Dawes rumbled with a heavy chuckle. His eyelids folded into deep creases. "God damn it," he said, "you're spoilin' my showpiece. And anyway, I do it all in my head." Shawcross laughed. "You're like me." He nodded. "I use my checkbook to write my notes in. But seriously, Rick, how long before you're ready to pick this mob of mine up?" Rick rubbed a hand down his chin. "Say a fortnight at the outside," he said. That'll give us time to overhaul the plant and run in some fresh horses." "How are your horses?" Dawes asked. He slid his leg off the desk corner and straightened in his chair. "Y'all need more than the mob you came in with the other day." "Yeah, that's what I mean," Rick said. "There's about 30 odd in that lot. They're over the bridge now, running on the common. We've got another 30 or 40 spelling out on the Urala Reserve." "Well, go out after 'em in a day or two." "Well, if you're short," Shawcross tipped back his chair again, "I can lend you some, maybe 10 or 20. I know how it is in a dry time. It's hard to keep any condition on 'em. You need plenty if they're gonna stand up to the work." He thought for a moment. "And the same goes for men. Jim here was telling me it's difficult to get stockmen in town at the moment. I'm paying off a couple and you can have them. They're both good men. You probably know 'em." Rick nodded. "We'll see how it goes," he said, "and probably take you up on it. Getting a cook seems to be the big problem. How do you get on with Bates, Jim? Did you manage to have a word with him?" Dawes shook his head. He ran a big hand round the back of his neck. "No," he grunted. "He ain't shown up at all. Like I said, he's probably lapping up the grog. You could look around for him when you're poking about town." "I'll do that." Rick nodded. Shawcross pulled out his watch and stared at the dial. "Why, what's the matter with him?" he said. "I know Bates well. He doesn't drink more than ordinary." "No," Dawes said gruffly, "but this ain't ordinary. He won about 400 quid in a 2-up game." "The hell he did." Shawcross was surprised. His chair thumped forward. "That's a decent little wad, in anybody's language." "When did he win it?" "Sunday," Dawes told him. "In behind the billiard room." He stared out through the doorway. Johnny, the aboriginal stockman, leaned against Shawcross' car bonnet. He rolled a cigarette. His dark face crinkled back at Dawes in a friendly, knowing grin. Dawes half raised a hand. "Your man's waitin'," he said to the old cattleman. "He's out there by the car." Shawcross slid the watch back into his pocket. "Yeah," he said, "I'd better be on my way." He walked towards the door. "Hey, Johnny, you go and tell Missus we're ready. Leavin' in 5 minutes." Johnny levered his tight-trousered length away from the car bonnet. "Sure, boss," he grinned. "Where Mrs. stop?" Shawcross jerked his head. "She's up at the cafe talking to Miss Joan." "Okay." Johnny stalked out of sight from the doorway. "I'll tell her, boss." "Well," Shawcross turned again to Rick, held out his hand. "So long, Rick. I'll be seeing you somewhere about a fortnight's time." "That's right." Rick shook the hand. "Jim here'll give you a ring the day I pull out. You can expect me 4 days after that." Dawes bulked up out of his chair. He towered over Shawcross, crushing his hand. "So long, Bill. Glad to have seen ya. You'll hear from me in a day or two, when I've fixed up all the details with Rick, pay and so on. And don't forget to have the exact numbers ready for me, so I can get the permits filled in." "Sure." Shawcross bow-legged it out through the doorway. His heels grated on the pavement. "You'll get 'em." He glanced back over his shoulder. "Did you say so long to Miss Shawcross?" Dawes waved his hand. "She's right," he said. "I said it this mornin'. It's unlucky to say it twice." "You're right at that." Shawcross nodded. He rocked on his heels across the pavement. Rick and Dawes watched him jerk open the car doors, wind down the windows, and wipe dust from the windscreen. The slight, elderly figure of Miss Shawcross showed for a moment. Johnny stalked behind her. His black hand twisted round a door handle. Miss Shawcross moved past him onto the seat. Johnny pushed his way among the sacks in the back of the car. Smoke twisted in with the dust as the car rolled away. Dawes sprawled back in his chair. "There it is," he grunted. "He's on his way. It'll be well after dark by the time he gets home." A tongue of dust licked in through the doorway. Rick felt the back draught from the car. "It will at that," he said. "That's a good car he's got there, but the goin's rough. You've got to watch your step if you don't want to break a spring." They talked together for half an hour. Rick swung his leg from the desk's edge and stared out onto the street. Dawes wiped his sweating neck. Heat stuck the shirts to their sweating bodies. Finally Rick slid off the desk. "The hell with this," he said. "I'm going for a walk. Maybe drop in at the pub for a drink. How about you?" Dawes shook his close-cropped head. Sweat oozed on his lined forehead. "No," he grunted. "I'm right. But I might do like we did last night. I'll see how it goes." Rick stomped his feet, easing the trouser fork out of his crutch. "You do that," he said, "and I'll see you around." He walked towards the door. "So long, Jim." "Yeah, so long, Rick." Dawes nodded. "I'll be seeing ya." Outside on the pavement, heat washed in under the awning. Rick strolled along, feeling the harsh, hot air drying his throat. Going past Jones' Cafe, Rick swung on his heel and peered at the curtain-draped window. "The hell," he thought, "a man might as well drink tea. It looks cool inside. Different to Dawes' rib-roasting office." He pushed open the door. His feet scuffed on the wide doormat. Behind the counter, Joan smiled a warm welcome. She watched Rick rock on his high-heeled boots towards a table. "Good," she thought. "That makes another one. Business is improving." Rick dragged back a chair. He looked across at Joan. "How's this?" he asked. "Is she right? Can a man have some tea to wash the dust down?" Joan brushed the hair away from her face. Quickly, she set crockery on a tray. "They're really funny," she thought, "these dusty, sweaty, shirted men who come in. They're different to the men who work in the stores or in the bank offices. They speak short and jerky, as if they're frightened to say too much." She hurried round with the tray. "Certainly," she smiled, "and would you like something to eat? Some cakes or sandwiches?" Rick's long body eased down on the chair. His legs stretched out under the table. To hell, he thought, a man's out of his depth. It was all right when old Miss Higgins had the place. She slapped it down in front of you and left you to like it. This one is different. All hair, skirts, and a pinafore. The cup she was setting on the table wouldn't hold an egg. Rick rubbed a hand down his face. "You can make it a sandwich," he nodded. "I don't go much on that fancy stuff. Th'ain't much to it." Joan nodded. The hair danced round her face. Her white hands fluttered on the cloth, smoothing out the creases. "All right," she said. "What would you like? Ham?" "Yeah." Rick stuffed his hat under the chair. "That'll do nicely, thanks." Joan whisked the tray down behind the counter. The urn hissed as she made tea. She stared at the back of Rick's head, the wide spread of his shoulders. At least, she thought, he did say thanks, which is more than most of the others do. She set the tea and sandwich in front of Rick. There, she smiled. I can put some more hot water on the tea when you want it. Rick's hard brown hand closed on the teapot, tipped it over the cup. She'll be right, he said. He felt uncomfortable, with Joan standing near. She was too damned clean. He remembered his bare, dusty foot. God damn it, he thought, Joe was right. A man hadn't had a swim for a fortnight. He stirred sugar into the tea. I ain't aimin' to stay long, he added. Just swallowin' a mouthful, then I'll be on my way. Joan smiled down at him. She held the tray poised in her hands. That's all right, she laughed. You don't have to hurry. I don't charge anything for sitting. Rick crossed his boots under the table. For crying out loud, he thought, I wish she'd go away. A man stinks like a camel in season. He lifted the cup up to his mouth. Thanks, he nodded, but I've got a job to do. Haven't meet a fella. Have to meet a fella. Joan smoothed a final crease on the tablecloth before she walked away. That's quite all right, she chuckled. But any other time you come in, you know what the charges are. She swayed in between the tables. Rick stared after her. His eyes softened. She moves like a thoroughbred, he thought, legged right up to the hips, and not too heavy in the shoulder. He'd be a lucky man who would handle her. He poured another cup of tea. His hand reached for the sandwich, folded neatly on the plate. Rick munched in thoughtful concentration, staring out through the window. Its criss-crossed curtains formed a triangle of light, coated on the outside by a heavy layer of dust. In the frame made, he saw 3 men walk past on the other side of the street. Rick put down the sandwich. The hell, he said. Now what would those bastards want with 'em? Joan glanced up, startled. Her eyes flickered round the cafe. Who's he talking to, she thought. Or rather, who's he swearing at? She felt her face redden. Did you say something? She said to Rick's sunburnt neck. Rick grated the chair round until he was facing her. He rubbed a hand down his chin. Joan saw the embarrassment in his eyes. Yeah, he grunted. I said something all right, and I'm sorry, I just wasn't thinking. He looked hard at Joan. His hand slid away from his chin to pick up the sandwich again. You know how it goes. A man forgets where he is. Joan wrung out a cloth she had been rinsing and hung it on a hook. She wiped her hands on a towel. From where she stood behind the counter, she could only see the top half of Rick. He's dusty and sweaty, she thought, but he's nice. Nothing bad about him. Like Mr. Dawes had said the other day, bad language was second nature to him, and suddenly she remembered where she had seen Rick before. Don't worry, she smiled. I can see I'll have to get used to it. Probably start to use it myself before long. Rick waited while he swallowed a mouthful of sandwich. He washed it down with tea. You won't, he said. You won't stay here long enough. A town like Yorinda ain't got enough in it to hold a girl like you. Joan rested her elbows on the counter. She felt impatient, almost angry. She brushed the hair back from her face. Every man I talk to, she said, who comes in here tells me that. What makes you all so certain that I won't like Yorinda? Rick shrugged his sweaty, shirted shoulders. The hell with it, he thought. A man's buying himself an argument. She's too damned pretty to argue with. If a man had any luck, he'd buy her something else. Rick reached for the teapot. When he tipped it, the spout dripped dry. Say, he said, she's gone dry on me. Do you think you could pour on some water? Boiling water, he added. Joan filled a jug from the urn. Certainly, she said, but you haven't answered my question. She moved round the counter and set the jug on the table, then picked up the jug again and poured the water into the pot. She waited, looking down at Rick. Rick stared past her hip roundness at the curtained window. Dust swirled in a scurry on the roadway. "Ah," Rick grunted. He waved his hand. "You just got to look around. There ain't nothing here except flies, dust, and loneliness." "That's what Mr. Dawes says." Joan held the empty jug in her hand. "That's what everyone says. You've all got it on the brain." "We've got it on the brain all right," Rick nodded. "The stinkin' sun burns it there." Joan laughed when he said it. He put so much emphasis on the stinkin'. If that's the case, she smiled. "Why do you all stay? You're no different from me." Rick glanced away from the window. His eyes crinkled at the corners. Their sun-bloodied blueness looked up at Joan. The top of her well-brushed hair, the flare of her tight-waisted frock, the slim ankles above her high-heeled shoes. Rick sprawled back in the chair. "The hell I ain't," he chuckled. "Just take a look at me." Joan blushed. She swung away quickly, in behind the counter again. "Oh," she said, "I didn't mean like that. You know very well what I mean." Rick filled his cup. He set the pot carefully down on the table. "God damn it," he thought, "if Mick and Joe could see me now, they'd think a man had gone sour on 'em." He stirred in some sugar. "Sure," he nodded. "I know what you mean. And the way I looked at ya is the answer. As for us fellas," he half turned round to face Joan, "we stay because most of us don't know any better. The bit of brain we were born with gets withered by the sun, and we just go on from there." Joan laughed. "Goodness," she said, "you can tell a story." She straightened some plates on a shelf in front of her. "Now tell me the truth. If it's as bad as you say it is, why do you stay here?" Rick rubbed a hand over his chin. "You know," he said, "it's a difficult question. It's one I've often asked myself, and when I come to look at it, I just don't know the answer." Joan believed him. "All right," she nodded. "If you don't know the reason why you stay here, then you don't know the reason why I'm going to stay here." Rick chuckled. "I reckon you've nailed me there," he said. "You've thrown the dice and made us quits." Joan bustled out from behind the counter. "Good," she smiled. "I'm glad of that. Perhaps you will give me some more custom." Then she added, "I'll have a better chance of becoming a permanent resident." Rick reached under the chair for his hat. His fingers fumbled on the wide brim. "Yeah," he nodded, "I'll sure do that, but I don't come to town all that much." He looked round the room, noted the fresh painted furniture, the bright tablecloths. "How's it going here? Are you doing all right?" Miss Higgins always seemed to make a quid or two. He pushed up to his feet. Joan came to stand beside him. "Yes," she said, "actually I've done quite well in the few days I've been open." "That's the idea." Rick rammed a hand into his pocket. He set some money on the table. "How's that?" he asked. "Will it cover it?" Joan looked down. "It's far too much," she said. "Take back the 2 shillings." She went to pick up the coin. Rick brushed away her hand. "The hell with it," he grunted. "Leave it lay. It's good for the business." He slid the hat onto his head, pulled the brim low over his eyes. "Well, I'd better be on my way. I'll be seeing you, miss. So long." Joan walked after him. His lean body almost filled the doorway as he went through. "So long," she smiled. "I'll be seeing you." "And the name is Joan." Rick stood with the door handle clenched in his hand. "It's a nice name at that," he nodded. "And I guess you will. So long, Joan." He let the door close behind him. After the cafe's coolness, the road glare blinded him. He squinted his eyes against it. God damn it, he thought. What a bastard of a country. You can't get away from the sun. It's always there, waiting for you. He walked towards the Ronde, under its wide verandahed frontage. Several men lounged in the shade. "Good day there, Rick." They nodded. "How's things?" Rick half waved his hand. "Not bad," he said. He jerked his head upwards, towards the brass-tinted sky. "She's still keepin' dry." Some of the men spat. "Yeah," they nodded. "She's dry all right." Rick elbowed in through the barroom door. "I wonder if they're here," he thought. They were heading up this way. He glanced the length of the bar. Bill Bates' hat tipped back on his head, stood belly close to the mahogany. On either side of him, the Dennis brothers rested on their elbows. They were talking. Bidet suddenly pushed upright. He held out his hand. "The hell, Bill," he said. "I was only asking ya." Rick stalked across. "Good day there, Bill," he drawled softly. "I've been looking for ya. I'd like to have a yarn with ya." Bill swayed in blear-eyed uncertainty. The sodden droop of his mouth twisted. He tried to speak without lisping. "Good day," he said. "Who are you?" "I don't know you." He screwed an eye up at Bidet, then at Dan. "Oh, Z," went on. "I don't know. Do I?" Rick put a hand on the old camp cook's shoulder, felt the dampness of sweat-soaked flannel under his fingers. "Sure you do, Bill," he said. "You've had a little too much grog, that's all. Come over here. I want to have a yarn with you." He gently pulled the old man's arm. Bill swayed closer. Rick smelt the belch of rum, saw the blurred face peering into his. Then the sagging lips spluttered. "May I go hop into hell?" The old man exploded. "If it ain't young Rick. Ain't seen ya in a long time, boy. Where the hell you been?" Rick kept his eyes hard, cracked his face in a grin. He glanced from Bidet to Dan. The dirty bar crawlers, he thought. They're spitting mad as snakes. There's going to be trouble. His hand viced tighter on Bill's arm. "Come on," he said. "Let's move over here. Maybe we can have a drink. I want to talk to you." Bidet jerked violently away from the bar. Blood drained from the taut skin each side of his face. "Goddamn you stinking guts," he hissed. "Bill's drinking with us. Flog your lousy hide out of it." The barman reached for a cloth. He swabbed it in a pool of slopped beer. His lip twisted. "That's right," he said. "Give it to 'em. I'm and his mates were in here last night trying to start a brawl." Rick eased Bill away towards the door. "Pull your lip down," he grunted, "and stand to it. There's nobody starting a brawl." He glanced from Bidet to Dan. "Unless you want to push it, the toss is up to you." Bidet balanced on his feet, felt the muscles ridge hard on his legs. The hell, he thought, the bastard's tough. No one has ever had him down. If I do it, I'll stamp on his face and spin on it. He felt Dan's elbow drive in his ribs, heard Dan's voice. "Go on," he urged. "What are you waiting on? Go in and finish 'em." Bidet slewed round viciously. He slammed a fist into Dan's chest, clawed at his sweat-stiff shirt. "Keep out of it," he grated. "I'll have 'em when I'm ready. You keep ya eyes skinned to see how it goes." Dan ripped his shirt out of the grasp, drove with his shoulder to beat the arm away. "Keep ya hands off," he snarled, "or I'll be in it too." He stared hard at Bede. "Maybe ya ain't got the guts." Bede pushed Dan backwards, heard him swear as the bar crunched on his spine. Bede inched forward, slipping the belt from his waist. He wrapped it round his hand. "All right, Rick," he grated. "It's on. I'm having ya, and the boots are in it too." Bill lurched to one side on uncertain feet, stumbled against the wall, hung there swaying. Rick bent over. The muscles on his lean belly tightened into walls. A heavy vein pulsed in his neck. "All right," he grunted. "If that's how you want it, I'm waiting." They inched slowly, cat-like, on their thin-soled riding boots. Not a man at the bar moved. Not a man spoke. The barman sighed, belching the air up from his flabby paunch. Bede slammed first. He drove the leathered fist at Rick's chin. Rick took it over the shoulder, felt it tear his ear. Close in under Bede's arm, Rick slammed in a 1-2. He heard Bede gasp as he backed away. "That's it," Rick thought. "Drive it into his belly. The bastard's full of grog. He won't take it there for long." Bede came in again. He grunted in vicious haste. The leathered fist smashed onto Rick's cheek, spinning him round. His hat went out under the door. Bill Yates staggered after it. Rick righted in time to meet Bede. With arm-aching force, he drove both fists again into Bede's belly. Bede doubled away. Rick went after him and smashed a fist into Bede's hissing lips. A thin line of blood spurted. Bede smashed back. The leathered fist slammed Rick back against the wall. He slid down. Bede kicked with his foot, driving his heel onto Rick's ribs. Rick sobbed. "The dirty bastard," he thought. "The dirty, crawling bastard. I'll kill him for that." He twisted over onto his hands and knees. Bede kicked again. Rick took it on the shoulder and viced his hands round the boot. He twisted it with bull-dogging fierceness. Bede slammed down onto his face. Rick levered himself over Bede's thrashing legs and kneed his hard body onto Bede's back. Now, he thought, I'll drive his skull right through the floor. Bede bucked upwards, forcing his body up from the floor in a vicious twist. Rick rode the buck and clamped his legs round Bede's jerking waist. "There, you bastard," he grunted. "Now get out of that." He slammed a fist onto the back of Bede's neck, tried to get a grip on it. Bede sagged, then jerked backward suddenly. His head smashed into Rick's face. Rick almost blacked out from the impact. Blood ran from his nose into his mouth. He spat a mouthful onto Bede's shirt, then smashed his fist onto the base of Bede's neck. Bede twitched once before he collapsed on outstretched arms. The barman jittered behind the bar. His hands fumbled round a bottle neck. He slid the bottle across to Dan. "Here," he said, "get in a finish, Don't give 'em a chance to get up. 'E's bloody near killed ye, brother." Dan closed his fingers round the bottle neck. He pushed away from the bar. "Yeah," he grunted. "He has it that. I'll split his bloody skull." Rick saw Dan coming. "The hell," he thought. "I've got my leg caught. I can't get out." He closed his hands on Bede's shoulder, tried to pull the slack body over. Dan grinned. "She's right, Rick," he grunted. "Just stay where you are. You make a sittin' shot." The door slammed open behind Rick. Mick hurtled across the room. Joe strained after him. Mick flung his full weight onto Dan, took the smash of the bottle on his chest. "You bastard," he grunted. His heavy fist pulped Dan's face, beat him down to his knees. Joe cannoned into Mick's back, tore at his shirt. "Let me at him," Joe choked. "Stand back, Mick, and let me at him." Mick flung him away. "The hell I will," he grated. "Ya can wait, ya flamin' turn." His hands groped for Dan, hauled him to his feet, then smashed him down again. Dan rolled over. His head rested on the brass foot rail. Mick waited. He pushed Dan with his foot. Dan groaned. Spittle slobbered from his drawn-down mouth corners. Mick chuckled. He held out a hand to push Joe away again. "He's right," Mick nodded. "Ease out like a lantern. You can give old Rick a hand." Joe looked round. He felt the tension leave his hands, his body relax. Rick had freed his leg. He was prodding it to get the circulation back into it. Blood had smeared round his nose, dripped onto his shirt front. Joe chuckled. He had too. There are times, he thought, when a man could cry. But what can you do? You have to crack your face. He leaned an elbow on the bar. His eyes stared hard at Mick. "He's right," he said softly. "He's right, mate. He's up on his feet." Mick nodded. He knew how Joe felt. He felt the same way himself, but what could you do? A man has to go it alone. He looked down at Dan, then across to Betty. Rick limped over close to the bar. He rested a hand on it. "Christ," he said, "I thought my leg was broke." Couldn't get any feelin' into it. Mick nodded. Joe nodded. They watched Rick's face, waiting for him to speak again. Rick jiggled the leg around. "Yeah," he said, "she's right now." He jerked a thumb, pointing over his shoulder. "You better take a look at him," he went on. "I may have cracked 'em too hard." Mick shook his head. "You ain't," he said. "The bastard's too rotten to die." He walked over to Betty, lifted his head up from the floor, and turned an eyelid back. "He's right," he grunted. "He's rollin' 'em now." He dropped Betty's head face down. Bill Bates staggered across with Rick's hat. He clapped it on Rick's head. His hand slid down onto Rick's shoulder. "She was a good go, Rick," he said. "You put up a good show. I thought he had you when he belted you round the head." Rick twisted a grin. His eyes felt tight, balled up in tightness of puffy skin. The torn ear ached. "You picked the right kind of company," he grunted. "A man should have left you to rot with 'em." The old cook nodded. He felt tired. A man needs a drink, he thought, to steady him up. "Yeah," he said, "maybe you ought at that." "How did it happen?" Mick started to say, then paused. 3 men shouldered along from the end of the bar. They nodded at Rick. "She was a good go, Rick," one of them said. He bent down to help Dan to his feet. The other 2 hauled up Betty. One slapped him on the face. "Come on," he said. "Snap out of it. You've had a belting. Get outside for some air. We'll shove your head under the tap." They all went out through the doorway. Mick spat carefully. He hitched his belt and looked round the bar. "Well, that's that," he said. "Now, where was I?" "Oh, yeah, that's right. How did it happen?" For crying out loud, Joe told him. "What does it matter? He jerked a thumb at the barman. "Hey you," he went on, "get us all a drink." He looked up at Rick. "I reckon you could do with one." Rick nodded. "I could at that," he said. "I've got a mouthful of blood." "Yeah, that's right," Mick said. "We'll have a drink and then go outside to clean you up a bit." The barman slid glasses on the bar. His glance flickered over Rick. "The cow chaser's tough all right," he thought. "He took a couple there. That would have poleaxed a bullock." He touched Rick on the arm. "Do you want some water," he said, "to wash off some of the blood? Your nose looks like a bit of a mess." Rick stared over the barman into the wall mirror. "You'd think I'd been dragged in the stirrup iron," he thought, and bounced on a gravelly road. He untied the handkerchief from his neck. "Yeah," he nodded, "that's an idea. Slip us over a bucketful." The barman shook his head. "I ain't got a bucketful," he said, "but I can make it a jug." "How will that do?" "I'll pour in a drop of whiskey." "Fine," Rick nodded. While Rick cupped his hands, Mick poured the water. Rick splattered it over the swollen nose, across the torn ear. The whiskey stung with a savage bite. "That's fine," Rick thought. "Heal it in no time. But a man'll have to watch the sun. Might fester it." He dried his face on the handkerchief. "She's right," he grunted. "As good as gold." A man could start all over again. "The hell he could," Mick said. He set the jug back on the bar. Joe shifted along the mahogany, sliding his glass. "Shift up here a bit," he said. "You've flooded the bloody deck. The water's up over your fetlocks." He turned to Bill. "They tell me you had a win. Cleared a big stack in the 2-up game." "That's right." Bill slapped his rump. "Got her all here. Every last 400 quid of her." Joe whistled. "For crying out loud," he said. "You're taking a chance. Why don't you put it in the bank?" Bill rubbed a sly finger down his nose. "Not me," he said. "She's too hard to get at. I like her where you can feel it rustle." "You'll feel it rustle," Mick joined in, "if someone cracks you for it." He looked at Rick. Was that what the brawl was over? Him getting tangled with the Dennis brothers? "Something like that," Rick nodded. "They had him as full as a boot." His puffed eyes glanced at Bill. "You seem to be right now, sobered up a bit. When I came in, you was staggerin'." Bill scuffed a hand over his head. "Yeah," he chuckled, "I was at that, but it soon wore off when you started skull bashin'. It'd sober anyone up. Say," he added to Mick, "you should have been here. It was a brawl and a half, although it didn't last long." By the look of Rick's mug, Mick grunted. "It's a good job it didn't." He hooked a thumb in his belt, crossed a boot over the other. "What the hell were you doing, Rick? Why didn't you go in with a belt, too?" Rick shrugged. "It wouldn't have made much difference," he said. "Anyway, it's over now. What I came in to see you about, Bill, is cooking. We're picking up a mob of bullocks within the next week or two, and we're short of a cook. Would you be in it for us?" Bill scruffed the hand over his head again. "God damn it," he thought. "A man's loaded up with enough cash to keep him for a month or two, and they want him to work." Still, they were a good team. A man could always carry it on the hip. 2 or 3 months on the track would give a man a good thirst. Bill thumped the hand on the bar. "Sure," he said, "I'll be in it. When do you want me to start?" "Not for a day or 2 yet." "No." Rick pushed the glasses across the bar. "Fill 'em up again," he nodded to the barman. He turned back to Bill. "So long as you start in enough time to get the stores right and the gear cleaned." "Sure, I'll do that," Bill said. He winked a bloodshot eye at Joe. I'll have another couple of days on the town, then I'll be out to your camp. Toss you a bit of tucker in no time." "Where are you staying?" Joe asked. He had his boot on the brass rail, an elbow on the bar. This is good, he thought, having a nice quiet yarn. No one around to bother us. Like being out on the track. Only a man had a beer at his elbow. He stared at the window. The sun was still hot on the panes. Bill rocked back on his heels. His thumb jerked up at the ceiling. "I'm staying here," he said. "Got a room up on the balcony. A man's handy for a drink." "Maybe he's too handy," Rick said. He eased the shirt away from his ribs. "That rib's not too good," he thought. "Might be a crack in it. Stings when a man breathes." He emptied his glass. "I don't know about you fellas," he went on, "but I think I'll beat it. Beer don't taste too good when your nose dribbles blood in it." Mick chuckled. "The hell," he said. "That's one way of putting it. But I'm with ya just the same. We'll head back to camp and cook a bit of tucker. I'll buy a piece of steak. As we go past the butcher's, Joe can get some bread." "I'm with ya," Joe grunted. He drained his glass. Set it back on the bar. "I was just getting set for a steady evening, but I'll string along." "You don't have to," Rick said. "No," Mick nodded. "You can stay on with Bill and have a couple." "Do that," Bill said, "and we'll make a night of it." "Like buggery," Joe said. "Anyway, I've got to get that soap. Come on, let's get out of it." They walked towards the door. "So long, Bill," they said. Bill looked after them. He felt lonely at the bar. "So long," he said. Out on the pavement, Rick walked in the middle. Mick heel-rocked along on one side of him. Joe bow-legged it on the other. "Say, Rick," tipped his hat low over his face to hide his eyes. "I've just remembered. How was it you fellas came in such a bloody hurry the way you did?" Mick scratched a finger behind one ear. Joe pulled his hat brim low. The sun was sinking towards the west. Its glare was hot in their faces. "We came looking for you," Mick grunted, "and saw your hat slide out under the door." Bill fell arm over tip after it. "Yeah," Joe nodded. "I'd know that hat in a sandstorm." "Is that how it was?" Rick said.